From the nation's capital, Washington Debates for the 70s. A series of programs designed to bring together for an open exchange of views and opinions outstanding authorities on vital issues facing the world of the 70s. The topic, the energy crisis, future options. Can we get more energy from coal and nuclear sources? What will happen to our air, water, and landscape? Now, here is Peter Hackis.
In some quarters, America's energy crisis has become the most heatedly discussed topic ever debated. There's almost unanimous agreement among the experts that the crisis is real, that it's been creeping up on us for about 100 years now, and that it's getting worse each day as we continue to use up our precious supplies of oil, coal, and gas. Where the experts disagree is in the area of what comes next. How do we stop our headlong race to use up what energy supplies we still have? What are the most promising new areas for research and development to meet our energy needs of the future? What about the future of nuclear energy? And what should be the conservation role played by you and me to help get us through this crisis? Most of those who know the energy field say there are some things that can be done to bring us out of the situation that faces us now. But what are America's future options on energy? What are some of the things that can be done now? And what are some of those most promising for 10, 20, or 30 years from now? What, for example, should be our future foreign policy toward the nations of the world which will be supplying more and more imported energy to power American industry and light our homes? Will our shortages ever reach the point where fuel rationing becomes a necessity? Must we change our time-honored way of life if we are to exist in the future world engulfed in a massive energy shortage? Welcome to another program presented by the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. 4 eminently qualified experts in the field of energy are ready to take part in today's roundtable discussion. Democratic Senator Jennings Randolph of West Virginia is chairman of the Senate Public Works Committee, where he serves as an expert on fuels and energy. It was Senator Randolph who led a move in the early 1940s toward conversion of coal to synthetic liquid fuels and the production of clean-burning gas from coal. Senator Randolph is a former newspaper and magazine editor, college professor, university dean, and business executive whose prime interest lies in the energy field. Republican Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon serves on both the Senate Appropriations and Interior Committees. He was for several years a state representative and state senator in Oregon, then was Oregon's governor for 8 years. Senator Hatfield's background includes World War II duty as a naval officer, a master's degree from Stanford University, and periods spent as professor of political science and later as dean of students at Willamette University in Oregon. Dr. Dixie Lee Ray is chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. She's a native Californian, holds degrees in zoology, and a PhD in biology from Stanford University. Dr. Ray taught science for 27 years at the University of Washington. Dr. Ray has been awarded many science and academic honors and is the author of many scientific papers, particularly in the field of marine biology. In 1972, Dr. Ray became the first woman ever named to fill a 5-year term on the Atomic Energy Commission, and in 1973 became the first woman to be appointed chairman of the AEC. Philip Trezise is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., with a wide background in government service. Mr. Trezise, who holds degrees from the University of Michigan, was a State Department official from 1946 to 1971, including service as a member of the top-level policy planning staff. He served as Minister of Economic Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo and was the American ambassador to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. Mr. Trezise was Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs from 1969 to 1971. With us to conduct this roundtable discussion is Dr. Paul Mccracken, a leading expert in the field of economics. Dr. Mccracken began many years of government service as an economist with the Commerce Department. Later, he served as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors during the Eisenhower administration, and more recently as chairman of that group in the Nixon administration. Dr. Mccracken is now Ezra Day Professor of Business Administration at the University of Michigan. And now, Dr. Mccracken.
To the ordinary American, this problem of energy seems to have come at us very suddenly. We've been acclimated throughout most of our lives to drive into the filling station and say, fill her up, or to turn on the air conditioner if we're too hot, or to turn up the thermostat if we're too cold. And the idea that there might not be anything at the other end to respond to this really never occurred to us. And then all at once, we find ourselves threatened with brownouts in the summertime if it gets too hot, and we hear about problems of gasoline shortages and that sort of thing. This problem seems to, at least to the ordinary person, this problem seems to have hit us very suddenly, and suddenly to have become very urgent. Now, you've been following this for a long period of time at the policy level here. How did we get here?
Well, Paul, of course, we were in this problem in the 40s. I had the responsibility to co-sponsorship with Senator O'Mahony of Wyoming the Synthetic Liquid Fuels Act of that era. In fact, I remember so very well the opposition that we had, frankly, to the efforts that we were making. We wanted to take coal and to process it into aviation fuel, as the Germans had already done successfully. We wanted to use oil shale for these purposes, and we wanted coal gasification and other developments to take place. We started out with some very good programs, and pilot projects were underway. And then the submarine menace subsided, and the crisis was over, and the American people, said, let well enough alone. And so the funding stopped, as you and others know. It's almost tragic that it did, because we were ready to move forward as we should have in that period, and in the 50s, in doing this job. I remember, and you've asked me, in 1959, I offered a resolution in the Senate to set in motion a fuels and energy policy, a commission to be established. No one was really interested too much in it, so it died of mourning. And then a little later, we kept at it, and now for 2.5 years, under a resolution that Senator Jackson and I and others have fostered, why, and in the Interior Committee, and the Commerce Committee, and the Public Works Committee, and the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, we've been really digging in on this problem because, of course, with the growth of population, with the reliance upon the imported petroleum from countries that may not be as friendly, perhaps tomorrow, as they are today, why, it wouldn't be a submarine menace, that would stop the flow. It would be a decision at the political level in those countries. So we've been presenting already some substance in the way of legislation, and we have other measures. I'll not go into them now. Perhaps we'll talk about them a little later that we think will be very helpful. I think it's important for us to realize that in this country we act so often after the fact rather than before it. But then really we had the fact, which pointed the way to something that we should have done at that time. I hope it's not improper for me to tell you that 30 years ago I flew in a plane fueled with aviation gasoline, coal, from West Virginia,
in other words,
processed into gasoline.
You
from
flew in a
Morgantown,
coal-burning plane?
Yes, from Morgantown, West Virginia, here to the National Airport. Senator O'Mahony and I were attempting to dramatize, perhaps, the need for this legislation, and perhaps it helped. It doesn't feel too good to ride over the Allegheny Mountains for the first time, on that kind of fuel, but we made it. But we were a little squeamish, Paul, I might say. Of course, Dr. Ray wouldn't be worried because she's so courageous. She comes before this ad hoc committee, and speaks with such fluency and expertise.
I was just going to ask you, was it the plane you were worried about or the fuel in the plane?
Well, the fuel in the plane. I must admit, Dr. Ray.
Well, I think that we ought to recognize, too, that your foresight is well known, and other members of the Congress. There were people in various agencies. The Geological Survey had made many prophecies about and had done surveys to show the nature and the extent of our renewable resources, the fuels that are here in this country. In the last years, the Office of Science and Technology has had a very important study on energy problems. A number of universities, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Columbia University have had important energy studies. Various private institutions and the fuel companies themselves have been warning us that this sort of thing is coming about. Thoughtful people have known for quite a long time that we were headed this way. There was going to come a time when the fuels and energy sources were going to be limiting. But as you say, it takes really getting right to the edge of it before it gets into the consciousness of the average person.
Yes, Doctor, I think that's true. A person, if he can't go to work, he'll realize it, won't he?
Oh, yes.
If his house is cold, he'll realize
Oh,
it.
yes.
If the hospital is cold, it will be realized. All of these come with impact upon people.
Well, I suppose if we're talking about what we do now, that is, the problem is with us now, and the question now is where do we go from here? There's no way we can no way we can turn history back now and do some things that it would have been desirable to have done earlier. Where do we go from here? What do you, Mark? What do you see down the way now?
Paul, I think we have short term, the long term. We have the traditional sources upon which we can base new technology for more efficient use of what we're actually producing now. Let me give you an illustration. We have approximately 10 million kilowatts that are produced by the great grid system of the Columbia and Snake Rivers, which is hydro energy. With those authorized projects and those that are underway, we can double the output of existing facilities without building new dams. In other words, we can put a third generator at Grand Coulee, a second powerhouse at Bonneville, and so forth and so on. So we can, in other words, make more efficient the existing systems. Secondly, we have an area of very interesting and I think intriguing potential in what might be called the exotic future. Nuclear fusion, the solar. We have a possibility that we're undertaking in Oregon through hydrogenation to translate some of the 55 million tons of wood waste every year into low sulfur content oil. 55 million tons of wood waste, if we recovered 10% of it, we could produce 7 million barrels of oil. So consequently, these are some of the exotic. Geothermal. But let me add one further thing that I think shows the interrelatedness of this particular problem. We cannot just address ourselves to the existing or future sources of energy without biting the bullet on some very difficult decisions, and that is, since World War II, we have not only added 60 million people to our population, but we have trebled our consumption of energy. This is not due to electric toothbrushes alone, or the simplistic approach that somehow if we just turn off the lights in the room that we're not using, that we're going to solve the energy problem. That's good energy conservation, but that's not going to solve the problem. We have made technological choices that have been counterproductive. They have been counter-ecological. They have been counter to this matter of energy consumption. We have moved from natural fibers to synthetic fibers. We have moved from forest products to aluminum, light metals, plastics, and glass, all of which demand more energy. Now, these are going to be difficult decisions to make. I'm not anti-light metals. But let me remind you that the light metals industry, the chemicals of this country today consume about a third, or 30%, of our industrial energy output. We have a new law in the state of Oregon prohibiting non-returnable cans and bottles in the soft drink and beer industry. It has been computed that if the nation at large had had this kind of law, we would be able to light the cities of Washington, Boston, and San Francisco and Philadelphia for a 6-month period just in that one area of technological production. The energy we would save. So these are some of the related decisions that we're going to have to make. I don't think we can just go on our merry way, say we're going to find new sources, exotic or improve existing. without addressing ourselves to these technological production questions. And I believe especially when you can see a forest product that grows by free solar energy, as compared to 30,000 BTUs that it takes to produce 1 pound of aluminum, is but one example of these technological choices I think we have to make.
Paul, I don't want to interrupt because Phil perhaps wants to speak, but I want to direct a thought to all of us, but especially to you, Mark, because you talked in this context. You know, we voted on the Alaskan pipeline, and personally, I want it to very much and want it to be constructed, want it to be used. But the people thought this is a final answer. This is the panacea. Why, with all the petroleum that would come out of the Alaskan venture, highly successful as we would want it to be, to the 48 states below Alaska in this country, we would only be providing about 10% of our needed petroleum supply. So, you know, people say that's the answer. Well, it isn't. And you've said it in other ways here. There's no just one answer, is there? It's broad. Yes.
Certainly.
Well, Paul, I think Senator Hatfield made a useful distinction, which I'd like to follow up, and that is the difference between the short term and the long term. That applies to the pipeline, I might say. But in the short term, it seems to me there isn't a great deal can be done, but your policy options are very limited. Consumption trends are fixed, and they're not going to change quickly. Supply responses will take a long time in most cases, even in the best of circumstances. So you have the next couple of years between now, say, and 76, in which I think we're going to have higher prices for energy, and that is that.
Consumer's going to pay.
The consumer is going to pay. Now, I think there are a few things we could do in the short run. One would be to defreeze the price of gasoline, which seems to me highly inadvisable to have a freeze on gasoline prices if we are indeed short of energy. Another would be to deregulate natural gas, which completely, it seems to me scandalous that the country should be paying discount prices for a premium fuel in a time of, which we say is a time of crisis. Now these could help a good deal, I think, in the short run, in terms of turning the consumer and turning the allocation of resources around. But basically, it's a medium-term and longer-term problem, and most of the solutions, I'm afraid, have a long-term aspect to them.
May I throw another one into that pot? We have a rate structure today based upon a reward to consumption, or even waste. Right. Because the higher amount of your consumption, the lower the rates. And I think this is another immediate short-term project that we could undertake. It's a tough one. People have grown used to this particular thing, but perhaps we should reverse the rate structure. The more you use, the higher the rates. And I think we'd find some very interesting conservation practices that would be voluntarily imposed very quickly.
Well, of course, if I may, as an economist, step into the discussion here, I'm supposed to be the moderator. But
you know, one of the right to an opinion.
Oh, I have a good many of them.
An expert is seldom right, but never in doubt.
You're right.
And I'm not in doubt. I'm not sure about the other. But in the law, you know, there's just no better way has been found to encourage people to economize on something that we need to be more prudent with than to have them recognize it's going to cost more. And I think that's the point that Phil was making here. We do, in a sense, have the paradox of a federal government encouraging the use of gasoline by a bargain, as it were, a bargain basement price. Well, what about, we'll want to spend a good deal of time here in our discussion on the fundamental issues, but what can the ordinary person expect now as he looks down the way here, just, you know, the next 12 months or so? What's a reasonable expectation?
Well, I can't tell you, you know, except to take fragments of the situation.
Sure, of course.
I know that the Senate has passed an amendment that we had on the fuel allocations bill, the mandatory bill, which I believe in, and I hope the House will act on this very, very promptly. But we had a sense of the Senate resolution, the Congress, thinking in terms of the reduction of speed limits, Paul, by 10 miles an hour. Now, you might feel that's not very much, but it does amount to a tremendous saving in gasoline. And I addressed a letter to the governors of all of the states, and I was delighted to say in the Senate today that more than 28 states have replied affirmatively that they are taking steps within their legislative or regulatory programs to do just this. That's just one little, fragment of what we can do that I think would help. And we're not going to have less cars operating. People say this, but it's not true. The highways will be built, the cars will operate, the trucks will move, the buses will be on the roads. This is a fact of life.
No, I'm sure you're right.
I think in the next year we're going to really not save so much as we're going to be more conscious of what our limitations are and perhaps learn conservation. And as the Senator points out, that may be only possible to save a little under that, but if you add that to the possibility, say, of addressing ourselves to home insulation, the studies have shown that 1,500 square foot home with the average construction, that if you would invest, say, about $248 in insulation, you could cut your fuel bill in half. Now, we have given very little attention, either from noise pollution or for other reasons, to the requirements in our building codes that would address themselves to this kind of conservation. Now, I think these are examples of what we're going to learn. We're going to learn to do without, we're going to learn inconveniences, and we're going to be more aware of our limitations and perhaps more willing then to accept some of these higher costs, perhaps some of the additional tax monies to go into research that is not that have been constricted. And now our Interior Committee has indicated your agency as a lead agency in a new commitment of R&D. Hopefully the House will go along with us and we'll fund it without the OMB coming along and impounding the monies after we appropriate them, so that we can get on with some of this business, not only on the short term, but in the long-range impact.
I hesitate to speak again because Bill, I know, is over here ready, but
we have no time limitations.
No time limitations. I understand.
The other two are just going to have to interrupt him. You go ahead, Senator.
Well, we're talking about what we can do, and already the scheduled airlines of the United States, several of them, have reduced the speeds of their aircraft moving between cities, and it shows a considerable saving of fuel. And as you know, Mark, in the Senate in the last few days, why, we've given attention to this, asking the Defense Department, at least the Air Force, to see if it can't draw back and conserve fuel by certain methods. And all of this is a mix, isn't it, of a conservation that you've mentioned of our fuels.
Bill, why not solve the problem by just importing more?
Well, at the moment, importing more isn't a great deal of a promising solution because the tankers are hard to come by, and at the moment, indeed, one of the big suppliers is apparently cutting back on output. I don't think.
What did you mean there?
Libya.
Libya, yeah.
So I don't think in the short run you can expect much in the way of increased supplies. In any event, we don't have the refineries to process a great deal more fuel oil or more crude oil if we could get it. So really the short run is things are pretty much fixed. All the things we're talking about are great ideas, but for some future period. And I don't see much for the next couple of years, but higher prices and a certain amount of rationing through price. And if I were advising the Senate, I'd suggest we hike the price of the excise tax on gasoline a bit, and that would be about as salutary a thing as could be done.
Well, I suggest we look down the way a bit. Apparently, in the short run, we're going to have to make do with, with heavy emphasis on conservation, slower speeds, perhaps better insulation of homes. But now, looking down the way, how about solving it with nuclear energy?
Well, I think when we get away from the short term, that we have so many fine possibilities, that what is really needed is to select the kind of thing that we really ought to concentrate on and marshal the resources in terms of the trained manpower, the scientific talent, the support, and the setting of responsibility to get the job done. I have to agree with all the rest of you in the immediate future. Really, it is set. We have to make do with what we have, with sort of the supplies that we know are available, and there will be probably shortages. It will have to be allotments, must be mandatory, and there must be as much fairness brought into it as possible. But if we look further ahead, we don't really have either an energy or a fuel problem at all if we want to use the things that we do have. And your state is a good example, Senator. We have lots of coal. The majority of the coal of the North American continent is located within the United States. If we wanted to concentrate on coal alone, we could derive a sufficient amount of energy from our coal resources to last us at least for several hundred years, given today's rates of utilization and a reasonable increase. But there are problems. And these problems are many, and we recognize them very easily. First of all is, how do you get the coal out of the ground without running head-on with the environmental problems of the scarring of the land, the difficult problems of safety of the workers, and you can say, well, can we use the coal without bringing it out of the ground? That means in situ gasification or retorting it under the ground, and this certain kinds of problems. We know that in the transportation and the combustion of coal, we have the problems of the ash, of the clinkers and the waste products, and the effluents. And this comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but the fact is, without treatments, there's more radioactivity released to the air from the burning of coal than there is from a nuclear power plant.
How is that again?
Yes, sir. There's natural radioactivity in most rock and stone and in the earth itself. And when you burn coal, the amount of radioactivity from the natural radioactivity of the coal itself gets into the smoke, and unless you have a special device to filter that out, there is a greater release of radioactivity from in the effluent of burning coal than is permitted in a nuclear power plant, because there are the special devices to filter it out in a nuclear power plant.
But coal can be made
But it can be made clean, exactly.
That's right. That's important.
Right. I agree with you completely, sir.
Spoken like an Appalachian.
We have coal in our part of the country too. But, it occurs in the west, it occurs in the southwest, it occurs in the northeast, here in the central Atlantic area, and so on. We have the problems of low BTU coal, and this gives certain kinds of problems. There's low sulfur and high sulfur coal, and all of these require special processing to make the coal clean, either before it's burned or to clean it up in the process.
There is, of course, the problem of the sulfur and that sort of thing, but there is also the problem of strip mining, and in other words, the problem of getting at the coal.
Well, of course, you're correct, Paul. Surface mining today accounts for more than 50% of all of our coal supplies that are moving into use. So it's a real problem. And, of course, Mark is very familiar with the legislative process in bringing that bill to the Senate floor. I only hope we'll bring a well-reasoned bill, a bill that will certainly have penalties in it, so that no one would surface mine and then move on to another location because he'd rather pay a fine. It'd be so small he couldn't do it. So the fines must be very high. The penalties must be written in. We can rehabilitate the land as we mine it. This is proven over and over again. We can't go back and, do what we failed to do a long time ago. There it was, just like these other subjects we talked about. That's in the past. There was a desecration of the land, no doubt about it. But from here out, we can do a job, and that's necessary to be done. So surface mining, I think, must be, at least for many, many years, a real source of the supply of coal in this country. And I hope we can have, Mark, that kind of a bill come out of the Interior Committee.
Paul,
yes.
Mr. Chairman, what Jennings has said, I think, illustrates another very overriding issue that we as politicians particularly have to face up and assume responsibility, and that is to reduce the polarization that exists today between economic need and environmental values. I think too often times we've seen politicians who have exploited this for the emotional value of votes at the ballot box, rather than trying to act as a catalyst, trying to reason and try to bring together these various interest groups. I'm thoroughly persuaded that out of 8 years as chief executive of our state, where we had as our major thrust economic diversification and economic growth and development, but paralleling that with more laws governing air and water pollution, more parks being built, more environmental concerns being expressed in law, that we show that there was not a mutual antagonism, but an ability there when you have the political leadership to create this role of putting together the economic needs within a context of environmental quality and environmental values. But I think this goes beyond the engineers, it goes beyond the researchers. It has to come back to political leadership that's responsible in trying to be a catalyst rather than exploiter of these emotional and these imbalances that we now have in this country.
It really bothers the ordinary person when we start talking about nuclear as sources of energy is the very simple question, is it safe? And we're still hearing a great deal of discussion about this and a fair amount of skepticism. What do you say to that?
Well, if these plants were not safe, the Atomic Energy Commission would not license them, would not permit them to be built, and certainly would not permit them to operate. Now, I think there are two things I'd like to emphasize here. First of all, there's no easier way to scare anybody than to say radioactivity.
That's the point, yeah.
That's right.
And there is, and I think that we have to admit it, we have not done a good job in making the basic understanding of what radioactivity involves clear outside the circle of scientists and nuclear engineers and so on.
Talking to yourselves.
We've been
really.
talking to ourselves.
Really?
You're quite right.
Could we use this as an educational opportunity and let me ask you a lead question?
Yes, sir.
Good.
Tell us about Hanford's experience, which has raised these questions so fresh in the minds of many people, not only of the Northwest, but of the entire country.
yes.
And you have a very excellent response I'm already aware of, but I'd like to have you use this medium to express that.
We had recently, as I think everybody knows, a leak from these waste storage tanks at Hanford. The leak involved 115,000 gallons, which sounds like a big number, and it is a big number. We're distressed by it. Nobody likes to have anything leak out, much less a material that has a lot of radioactivity in it. But I think we have to put it into perspective. And first of all, recognize that the waste that is in storage at Hanford is waste that has accumulated over a period of 30 years and has come almost exclusively from the weapons program. And in the process of the production of the material for the weapons program, which our country over these 30 years period has deemed to be necessary in our national security program, the wastes have been accumulated all there. There are 65 million gallons of waste material. The decision to put these wastes into storage tanks buried in the ground was made nearly 30 years ago. And I don't think that we are in any position to point a finger of blame at the people who, in the light of the technology then known and with the best available information, decided on how to handle those wastes at that time. The selection of Hanford as a location for the production plants, mainly for making plutonium and for the waste storage, that selection itself was based upon considerations of finding a remote area, finding an area that where the ground characteristics, the soil itself, were felt that could be a receptacle for the waste. In fact, clearly, in the beginning, it was never expected that those tanks would hold the wastes forever. It was expected and understood that in time, 10, 20 years, they would corrode and the waste would leak out into the ground and the earth itself would be the final receptacle for the waste. We no longer consider that a good way to do it. But that was what did happen, and we're stuck with doing something with that decision. But because that decision was made, and because it was expected that the soil would be the receptacle, that soil has been studied over this 30-year period, and there's no place in the earth of this nation that we know more about than the characteristics and the geology of that soil itself. Over the years, there have been some leaks. We know exactly where the radioactivity is. We know exactly what the characteristics of the soil are with respect to adsorbing and holding it, where they will move, over what periods of time, and so on. So that I can say without question that there is no danger.
Phil, I'd like to, before we don't want to leave out the international aspect of this. You indicated that tankers are short now, and so in the very near term, this doesn't constitute a solution to the problem. But all projections do seem to suggest that we're going to have to be relying very substantially more on foreign sources of oil, in other words, for our energy. Now, what does this mean for, here we get into foreign policy and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. What kinds of things do we need to be thinking about?
Well, I think in the medium term, and that is for the latter part of this decade, we're going to be in a somewhat different situation.
By the way, I think that's worth emphasizing, that the medium term is toward the end of this decade.
Right.
This is a long lead time problem.
Right. Now, most of the things we've been talking about tonight, nuclear power, geothermal, all of them are in the 80s. They really are not in practical possibilities for this decade. But later in the decade, there seems to be a fairly good prospect that the high prices that we'll obtain in the next few years are going to, A, cut back on consumption, on the growth of consumption, and are going to bring in some new supplies. And some of those are quite evident, Alaska, the North Sea, and so on. And that we're going to have an easy period, relatively, when world prices for oil will be softer and the pressure on supplies will not be so great. And that may be the very difficult period for deciding on policies, because everything we talked about tonight is costly. And we have to have long lead time investment. And you have to make choices among these things, because the viability of one or another is by no means proven. And all of this is going to come up, it seems to me, at the end of the decade, when the crisis will seem a good deal further off. If we want to go to self-sufficiency, then we've got to make some very hard decisions at a hard time.
Well, let me ask a very blunt question here. What does this mean for us in terms of the Middle East problem? This is an uneasy part of the world. That's where the oil is. How do we feel our way through this problem?
Well, it seems to me there are two parts to the problem. One is the purely emotional, political, if you will, problem, and which is not predictable. If there's another war in the Middle East, I don't know what will happen. I don't know how anybody knows what the producing states will do. They're not one, you know. They're Arab states or Iran. They have differing interests and differing capabilities. But this is essentially beyond prediction, and one of the hazards we've got to live with. The other is the bargaining position of the oil-producing states in terms of their supply position, and that, as I say, in the latter part of the decade, may not be so strong. And the uncertainties that they will face about markets will be considerable. And it will be possible, it seems to me, to strike arrangements with them, leaving aside these unpredictable political events, which will be tolerable. Mm-hmm. And so if we do want to go to self-sufficiency, or a greater degree of self-sufficiency in the longer term, we're going to have to make, as I say, difficult, excruciatingly difficult decisions about spending a lot of money at a time when it doesn't seem very necessary to spend a lot of money.
Could I add something to that? Because it does have to do with nuclear in a way that most people don't think about. And that is this, that a good many nations in Europe, and particularly Japan, are going nuclear at a much faster rate than the United States is. But what are they doing? They're buying American-designed nuclear power plants, and the fuel, which is enriched uranium, is essentially an American monopoly. We have here a native technology which is very highly desired. Right now, AEC has firm contracts for the sale of $20 billion worth of enriched uranium abroad. And this is a contribution to the balance of payments program that I think few people really recognize.
You know, if I had to identify just 2 or 3 points in our discussion, which it seems to me is extremely important to emphasize, it would be such points as the point that you were making about the fact that technology is developing now to where we can prudently and ecologically use our coal resources. And then the point that you made, that you're certainly right, that if there's any phrase in the English language calculated to scare us, it's radioactivity. We just sort of were paralyzed at that point. But apparently it's safer than what many of us fear, at least. And then I was interested in your point that while we face this sort of medium-term problem, Down the way here, there may be a change in the balance between demand and supply in the oil market itself. Well,
What about the deepwater port situation? Will that help?
Well, that's still another constraint on our ability to
transport effectively.
In the short run, until we have ports, we can't take the big tankers.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I don't want to inject this issue at this point, but I don't think we can just pass over the Middle East with general phraseology about Arabs and Israelis. This is a very explosive political issue, and we know this. Right or wrong, we can't go back and fight the Six-Day War over. But the point is simply this. This administration and the federal government of the United States has lost credibility with the Arab states. And any way we look at it, we have to, if we're going to be a peacemaker and if we're going to have any kind of guarantee of future oil supply, we have to get an even-handed, balanced foreign policy out there in the Middle East. That's not very cricket or I suppose very political to say these things, but we've got to bite the bullet here. We've got to recognize that Israel cannot have unlimited command upon our military supplies based upon their determination of parity or security. And then when you talk about an Israeli secure border, it's got to be secure on both sides. It can't be just on one side. Now, all I'm saying is we don't want to be pro-Israel, and I think our policy has been so pro-Israel that we have lost the credibility and the support amongst many of the historic, traditional Arab states. And I don't think we have to be anti-Israel any more than we should be anti-Arab. But we should be pro-American in looking at ourselves as the peacemaker and of having a supply guarantee because they have confidence and trust in our foreign policy.
As we listen to the differing views of experts in the field, it becomes obvious that there's no unanimous answer to the problems that present themselves to this country as we continue to use up our supplies of energy. There are, however, several options for both the near future and for the long-term future, options which we are told must be used with extreme care and with the very best long-range planning to guarantee this country's very survival. To challenge our round table of experts, let's go now to our panel of energy specialists for their questions.
May we have questions now from the floor? Yes.
I'm Fred Weinhold from the Energy Policy Project. We've talked about many options that we have and choices that will have to be made, tough choices. The thing that troubles me is that we've had some choices up to now, and we're not being very effective in making the choices. Perhaps this question would be addressed to the senators, but who and how should we make, who should make these choices for the future, and how should they be made? Specifically with where do we place superports? Where do we place do we decide to go into states like Colorado and Wyoming and Montana and make massive developments in there, even though people say we might be able to restore the environment? And then when we put in coal plants and we make major changes to the environment along the beach and the coastlines, who is going to be able to make these choices? The local people, the federal government? How do we see that we get energy and meet these environmental and local needs?
Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, Fred, I will, try and respond. I think the Congress has the major responsibility. I believe, however, that there should be this partnership between the executive and the legislative branches of government. We attempted to do this, and the administration said, we're not interested. That's exactly what happened. We tried to bring these two bodies together to have a fuels and energy policy for the United States. We tried very diligently to do this many, many years ago, and we tried it, 3.5 years ago. All I can say today is that I think there must be an understanding between the executive and legislative branches. We can't do other than have a working partnership. That word may be namby-pamby, but it's a partnership that we got to have. This accusing someone, pointing the finger at some agency or something of that kind is not going to suffice. We're going to have to do, Paul and our panelists here I think might agree, we're going to have a tremendous research and development program in the United States?
George Renshaw, the University of California at Berkeley. Listening to the panel, I could sense an interest in or emphasis on self-sufficiency and economic autarky. Is not this contradictory with the present-day trends in the world? The trends, especially since the Second World War, and perhaps in connection with our current Soviet-American relations when we begin to trade in technology and other goods, should not we maximize our international commercial opportunities as regards energy by following policies which would remove artificial obstacles? And I have a feeling that the panel, except for Senator Hatfield, has not been addressing itself to perhaps this question.
Well, Phil, you were Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs. I think that's right in your bailiwick.
Well, I had hoped I was careful not to commit myself on whether we should aim for self-sufficiency or not. I think this is an open question and one that deserves a good deal of debate. There are obviously some considerable hazards in dependency on other people for so vital, so critical a commodity as energy raw materials. It seems to me that's not really an arguable question. At the same time, we may be able to get our energy supplies a great deal more cheaply if we import them, and this may be for a long period of time, forever, for all I know, be quite safe, consistent with all the security interests you can dream up. I'm not sure what the answer is. I do know that self-sufficiency is very likely going to be a costly affair, and if we're going to be self-sufficient, then the American people better be told that they're going to have to pay for it. And
by pay for it, you mean higher prices?
In higher prices.
Could I supplement what Phil has said? Answer to it's a very probing question. I feel very strongly that when we see Japan and European countries faced with the necessity of supplies from other countries, we know this is factual. But we also know that in Russia and the United States that we have within our countries the ability to be self-sufficient. And I think it is incumbent upon us that we get at that job just as quickly as possible. I have this strong feeling. I express it in a different way than Phil has. But I don't think we can rely where the security of the United States is involved, always upon a supply from the Arab countries or African countries or whatnot. What do you think, Mark?
Could I put this into a totally different context, and perhaps a little sensitive one? We represent 6% of the world's population, and last year we consumed 40% of the world's energy. I would like to put it into the moral, if possible, ethical context. It seems to me the United States has a responsibility not only to continue to upgrade our own standard of living and our life, the comforts and what else you want to put to it, but I think we have a responsibility to develop new sources, to develop greater supplies, and to reach out into the have-not world or to the underdeveloped world, taking from them that resource for our own particular selfish needs, so to speak, without recognizing that the gap between the haves and the have-nots in this world is widening rather than narrowing, and that's the most explosive, in my opinion, the most explosive single element that could create war and maladjustment of people in relation to one another, and why I feel that outside of the political context, which can be argued one way or the other, there is a moral responsibility we have not to consume the energy at such rates that take away from other parts of the world when we represent such a small part of the world's population.
Another question. There's Claire.
Somewhat in the same vein. I'm Tish Davis from Environmental Affairs in HEW. And tonight we constantly seem to be bringing up the subject of an increase in cost. And it seems to me that given that energy use is essential to the very functioning within this society, that this once again seems to place a greater burden on our country's poor. And I'm wondering if you see any way of counteracting this somewhat regressive effect. You've mentioned a change in rate structure, and I was wondering if you see any other changes.
Would you like to comment on that?
Well, of course, I think we share with Tish the strong commitment to do what we can for those who have lesser incomes. I feel that very strongly in the fields in which I have worked. We had today a bill signed by the President to rehabilitate the handicapped in this country. Just one more step, persons who need help. I think we have to realize, and I don't know whether Mark shares this as a legislator, that we are a country in which the taxes in the United States are lesser than in any other industrial country of the world. Now, that doesn't, of course, take care of a situation. I understand that, but still, when comparisons are made, we're really not at the top tax-wise upon people.
This is not only true in the field of energy, but any time that we begin to talk about constriction of consumption, we're always going to find the impact heaviest upon the poor. That's why the conference on environmental questions that met in Stockholm, that some of the developing countries said it's very easy for you developed countries to talk about environmental values that restrict economic growth and development, because you already have reached that point that we're hoping to reach. And we're not about ready to adopt your restrictions and so forth that you're trying to impose upon us. This is not only true nationally, but internationally. And I think Senator Randolph put his finger on it, is that we have to therefore be creative in these other areas of development, education, rehabilitation, so forth. But most especially it comes back to that balance between economic needs and environmental quality. Let's not forget, again, that this is, oftentimes you hear the loudest promoters of environmental restrictive legislation coming out of the affluent class of this country, who have little hobbies going around, you know, creating ideas like this. Now, they've contributed. I'm not demeaning them at all.
Another question. Yes.
Ned Beach, I'm with the Senate Republican Policy Committee, and I think perhaps my question should best be directed to Dr. Ray, although it's not exactly in the area that I understand she's associated with. We've been talking about alternatives, and it seems to me that some of the things we should consider are alternatives that haven't had much done to them yet, or perhaps which haven't been adequately exploited and maybe are free for the taking if we just knew how to do it. I'm thinking, for instance, besides the solar energy and geothermal source, has any work been done on really making something out of the tidal change, out of the winds of the earth, which can do tremendous damage? Therefore, they should be able to do a lot of good, too. The change in barometric pressure, which affects a tremendous area and is several pounds per square inch involved occasionally, and the ocean currents. Those are the ones I jotted down. I'm sure there are many more. But would you like to comment on it?
Oh, yes, I'll be happy to.
Windmills.
First of all, let me say there's no such thing as a free lunch. And any source of energy will cost something. Because the sun shines up there doesn't mean that one can collect its energy and convert it either to space heating or to electricity without costs. And those will be there, and in some cases they'll be considerable. Calculations show that for solar energy alone, if we were really to make the arrays of solar cells with present technology that would collect enough of the sun's energy really to develop a central power station to produce electricity, say at 1,000 megawatts, the cost would be 3 to 4 times that of any of the kinds of fuel sources we presently use.
That is, the equipment would be 3 to 4 times the generating plant today.
That's right. And of course, the amount of land area that would be occupied would be enormous.
Okay.
On the other hand, for some things, as for example, for the heating and perhaps for the cooling of homes and one-story buildings, this technology is already feasible. The main thing that is lacking is there is not the already developed manufacturing capacity for the producing the components, because the market hasn't been there, and this may develop. Now, with respect to the others, of course, we recognize that windmills have been used for certain purposes for a long time, and there have been some interesting new technological developments in design of windmills, from the old type with the fan spinning this way, which aerodynamically are much more efficient. And there is work on these to develop enough power to run a small generating plant. One of the problems with wind, as it is also the problem with tides, ocean currents, well, not so much currents, say, as ocean waves, take those three, is that they are intermittent. They do not come at the time when you've got the peak demand, and they are not dependable or predictable. Now that, I'll take it back from the tides, they are predictable. But they all come back to the problem that we do not as yet have a good way of storing energy. Now, there is an operating tidal power plant, and that's off the coast of Brittany in France. It is operating, it does generate electricity. You have enormous tides there, of course, second only to the Bay of Fundy tides. But it is not economic. Now, I may say one more thing about the tides. It's interesting that the movement of the tides back and forth, put a nickel in the wrong slot here, back and forth on the shores of the earth causes a certain amount of friction against the land underneath.
Sure.
And it is possible to do a little calculation, and we can show that the force involved here, the energy involved, is equal to all of the energy utilized at the present time in the entire world. But you see, it's very widespread. It's very diffuse. And what you need to generate electricity is it concentrated. That's the hard thing to do.
I want to say, by the way, on this matter of dependability, I can think of some hot days in July back on the farm when I was a boy when the windmill was not very dependable and I had to pump the water.
I was going to suggest to Dr. Ray, how about a big enough grid with three main points where the tides are different, they're predictable, they're precisely on tables, and one's going up and one's going down. And you keep pumping the juice in from different locations, you see.
Then you have the problem of long-distance transmission, and that's another one where we have great losses that require R&D. That's a very important one. Let me say one thing further on the predictability of tides. Yes, indeed they are, but for 1 year at a time. You ever stop to think we never predict tides more than 1 year ahead?
Doctor, I thought the poet said, you know, one ship sails east and another west by the self-same winds that blow. That's what the poet said. What about it? Well, you said they're predictable.
And the winds are not predictable. And you can, by the application of good aerodynamics and skillful seamanship, you can sail into the wind.
That's right.
That's it.
The set of the soul, huh?
Right.
Right.
I think
and the goal.
And the goal.
I think this poetic note is a good one to end on.
At this point in time.
At this point in time. We do appreciate very much having our panel with us this evening, Mr. Philip Trezise from the Brookings Institution, Senator Randolph, Dr. Ray of the Atomic Energy Commission, Senator Hatfield, for this extremely lively discussion here of what I think all of us consider to be one of the most important and difficult problems of public policy today.
This roundtable discussion has brought you the views of 4 knowledgeable experts who have differing opinions on the basic issues involved in our current energy crisis. It is the aim of the American Enterprise Institute to illuminate the issues by presenting many such opposing views in the hope that by so doing, those in decision-making positions will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. This is Peter Hackus in Washington.
Washington Debates for the 70s is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. Produced in the nation's capital by Broadcast News, Washington.